I discovered the construction equipment on my frozen lake on a Tuesday morning in January, and by the time I understood what was happening, 47 concrete foundation pillars had already been drilled into the ice. My name is Jackson Strickland, and I own 200 acres of pristine wilderness property in northern Minnesota, about 30 miles west of Duluth. The centerpiece of my land is a natural spring-fed lake that spans roughly 15 acres at its widest point. I inherited this property from my grandfather 5 years ago, and I had spent every spare moment since then fixing up the old cabin and enjoying the absolute peace that comes from being surrounded by nothing but pine trees and wildlife. I worked remotely as a software engineer, which meant I could live anywhere with decent internet, and I had chosen this slice of heaven. The lake freezes solid every winter, typically from late November through early April. We are talking about ice thick enough to drive trucks on, which apparently gave the Pine Valley Heights Homeowners Association some very bad ideas. I had been in Minneapolis for 2 weeks visiting my sister when it happened. When I left, my lake was a pristine white expanse of snow-covered ice. When I returned, it looked like an industrial construction zone had been teleported onto the frozen surface. There were wooden stakes with orange flags every 20 feet, construction trailers parked on the ice, portable toilets, cement mixers, drilling equipment, and crews of workers swarming around like ants on a dropped popsicle. I drove my truck down the narrow access road to my property, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. A chain-link fence had been erected around the perimeter of the lake with a gate that was currently standing open. I pulled through and drove right up to one of the construction trailers. A man in a hard hat was studying some blueprints spread across the hood of a pickup truck. I got out of my vehicle and walked straight toward him. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice carrying across the cold January air. "What the hell's going on here?" The man looked up, seemingly unbothered by my tone. "Construction project. You need to clear the area if you are not authorized personnel." "This is my property," I said, pointing at the lake and then at the surrounding woods. "All of this, my land, my lake. Who authorized this?" The man frowned and pulled out his phone, scrolling through something. "This is Pine Valley Heights Development, HOA approved. All permits are in order." "Pine Valley Heights is 2 miles that way," I said, pointing east. "This is private property, my private property." That got his attention. He set down his phone and really looked at me for the first time. "You're Jackson Strickland?" "Yes." "Hold on." He walked to the trailer and climbed inside. I could hear muffled voices, and then he emerged with a woman who looked like she had been born wearing a pantsuit and holding a clipboard. "Mr. Strickland," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "I am Veronica Ashford, president of the Pine Valley Heights HOA. There seems to be some confusion." "No confusion," I said flatly. "You are building on my property without permission." Veronica pulled a document from her clipboard and held it out to me. "Actually, we have all the necessary permits. The county approved this development 6 months ago. These luxury lakeside condominiums will provide valuable housing and increase property values throughout the region." I took the document and scanned it. My blood ran cold as I saw legal descriptions of land parcels, but something was immediately wrong. "This says parcels 447 through 493. My property is parcel 302. The lake itself was designated as county waterway," Veronica said smoothly, "which means it is subject to development under the Regional Growth Initiative passed last year." "That is completely false," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "This is a private lake on private property. It is not connected to any other waterway. It is spring-fed. There is no county designation because the county has no jurisdiction here." Veronica's smile tightened. "Mr. Strickland, I understand change can be difficult, but progress cannot be stopped. These condominiums will be beautiful additions to the landscape. You should feel fortunate that your property value is about to skyrocket." "Get off my land," I said. "All of you, now." "We have permits," she repeated, her voice taking on an edge. "Legal permits. If you interfere with this construction, you will be the one facing legal consequences." I looked past her at the lake. I could see where they had drilled dozens of holes through the ice. The foundation pillars extended deep into the water below, anchored in what I presumed was the lake bed. My lake bed. They had worked fast during my absence, probably hoping to establish enough of a presence that it would be harder to remove them. I will be calling my attorney, I said, and the sheriff. Do not drill another single hole. Veronica shrugged. Feel free. We have been working with Sheriff Morrison's office throughout this entire process. Everything is above board. I got back in my truck and drove to the cabin, which sat on a hill overlooking the lake. From my porch, I had a perfect view of the entire construction disaster. I pulled out my phone and called my attorney, a man named Harold Chen, who had helped me with the property inheritance. Harold, I need you right now, I said when he answered. The HOA from the development 2 miles away is building condos on my frozen lake. There was a long pause. Say that again? I explained everything while watching the construction crews continue their work through my binoculars. Harold listened without interrupting, and I could hear him typing notes. That is aggressive, he said finally, and almost certainly illegal. Private lakes in Minnesota are exactly that, private. There is no mechanism for a county to suddenly designate them as public waterways without a lengthy legal process that would have required notifying you as the property owner. Send me photos of everything, the permits they showed you, the construction, all of it. I will file for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning. What do I do until then? Document everything, but do not physically interfere with them. If they have fraudulent permits, we do not want you catching charges for assault or property destruction. Let me handle this legally. I spent the rest of the day photographing and videoing every inch of the construction site. I counted 47 foundation pillars already in place, each one drilled through 3 feet of ice into the lakebed below. The pillars were arranged in neat rows, clearly laid out for maximum density. Each condo would apparently have a lakeside view, which was generous of them considering it was my lake they would be viewing. As the sun set, the construction crews packed up and left, but Veronica made a point of walking past my cabin on her way out. She stopped and looked up at me on the porch. You will get used to having neighbors, Mr. Strickland, she called out. Might even come to enjoy it. Pine Valley Heights has a wonderful community, very tight-knit. I like solitude, I called back. That is why I live in the middle of nowhere, on my own private property. Not so private anymore, she said with a smile that made me want to throw something. Then she got into her Mercedes and drove away. I barely slept that night. Every hour I would get up and check the lake, paranoid that they would try to do more work under cover of darkness. But the site remained quiet, just the wind howling across the frozen expanse and rattling the construction trailers. Harold called me at 8 in the morning. We have a problem. I started making calls, and it turns out that Veronica Ashford's husband is Richard Ashford, a county commissioner. He was part of a 3-person committee that pushed through an emergency waterway designation for your lake last October. How is that legal? It probably is not, but they are banking on the fact that by the time you fight it in court, the condos will already be built. Possession is 9/10 of the law and all that. I am filing the injunction today, but I need to warn you, this could take months to resolve. The ice will melt in April, I said slowly, an idea forming in my mind. What? The ice. They are building on the frozen lake because it is solid enough to support the weight right now. But come April, when the spring thaw happens, that ice is going to melt. Harold was quiet for a moment. Those foundation pillars are anchored in the lake bed. Even when the ice melts, they will still be there. Right? But they are trying to build actual structures on top of those foundations. Wooden frames, walls, roofs. If they build all that on the ice and then the ice melts, everything is going into the water except for those concrete pillars. Jackson, I cannot advise you to deliberately let them proceed with construction that you know will fail. I am not letting them do anything, I said. I am telling them to stop. You are filing an injunction telling them to stop. If they choose to ignore both of us and continue building on a frozen lake that will obviously melt, that is their decision. That is a dangerous game. They started it. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched the construction proceed at a breakneck pace. Harold's injunction had been filed, but a hearing was not scheduled until March, nearly 2 months away. Veronica's husband had apparently greased enough palms to ensure that the legal process moved at a glacial pace, ironically slower than the rate at which her crew was building on actual glacial ice. The foundation pillars were topped with wooden platforms. Then, framing began. Within a week, I could see the skeletal outlines of 47 small condo units rising from the surface of my frozen lake. They were building them like a mobile home park, prefabricated sections that could be quickly assembled. Walls went up, roofs were attached, windows were installed. I called Harold every few days. They are still building. I know. I have been documenting all of it. When we finally get in front of a judge, this flagrant violation of the injunction request will not look good for them. That hearing is in March. The ice starts thinning in mid-March. By April, it will be completely gone. Jackson, what are you planning? Nothing, I said honestly. I'm just waiting for spring. Veronica came by my cabin regularly, always with some new pitch about how wonderful the Pine Valley Heights community was going to be. She brought me brochures showing artist renderings of the completed condos, complete with happy families standing on docks and kayaking on the lake. Your lake is going to be the crown jewel of our development, she said during one visit in mid-February. We are planning a grand opening in May. You should consider selling us your remaining land. We would pay top dollar, and you could move somewhere more suited to your lifestyle. I like my lifestyle just fine, I said, and you are aware the ice is going to melt, right? She laughed, actually laughed. Of course, that is why we have the foundation pillars anchored in the lake bed. The structures are secured to those pillars with steel brackets. When the ice melts, the condos will effectively become floating units, like houseboats, but anchored in place. It is quite innovative, actually. Our architect won an award for the design. I stared at her. You are building floating condos. Luxury lakeside living, she corrected. Each unit will have its own dock, accessible by a series of floating walkways that connect back to the shore. We have already sold 32 of the units in pre-sale. On my lake. On a county-designated waterway, she said primly. Mr. Strickland, I really think you need to accept reality here. We have the law on our side. The permits are valid. The construction is happening. Fighting this is only going to cost you money in legal fees. After she left, I called Harold again. They are claiming the condos are designed to float when the ice melts. That is actually somewhat clever, Harold admitted. If they pull it off, it might be harder to argue for removal. A court might decide it is less disruptive to let them stay and fight over compensation instead. Is the spring thaw really going to support 47 floating buildings? I am a lawyer, not an engineer, but it seems like a lot of weight to have secured to a lake bed. The real question is whether those pillars can handle the stress when the ice melts and the full weight of the structures is suddenly suspended in water instead of resting on solid ice. Guess we will find out. By early March, all 47 condos were essentially complete. They looked absurd, a little neighborhood of identical beige structures sitting in neat rows on the white expanse of my frozen lake. Veronica's crew had even installed the floating walkways, though they currently rested on the ice. Decorative lampposts had been added along the walkways. Each condo had a small porch with railings. It would have been impressive if it was not completely insane and entirely on my property. The court hearing finally happened on March 15th. I drove to Duluth with Harold, and we sat in a courtroom, while Veronica's attorney, a slick man named Peter Wainwright, argued that the development was entirely legal and proper. The county commissioners followed all appropriate procedures in designating the waterway, Wainwright said smoothly. Mr. Strickland had the opportunity to appeal that designation within 30 days of the public notice. He failed to do so, thus forfeiting his right to challenge. What public notice? I whispered to Harold. Harold stood up. Your Honor, my client was never notified of any designation hearing. No certified letters were sent to his address of record. No posting was made on the physical property. The only notice was allegedly published in a county newsletter that has a circulation of approximately 200 people and is not freely available to the general public. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Kowalski, flipped through the documents in front of her. Mr. Wainwright, do you have proof that proper notification was provided to Mr. Strickland? The notice was published according to county regulations, Your Honor. We have an affidavit from the newsletter editor confirming the publication date. But no direct notification to the property owner whose land was being designated? Judge Kowalski asked pointedly. Wainwright shifted his weight. The regulations only require publication, Your Honor. Direct notification, while perhaps courteous, is not legally mandated. Judge Kowalski looked thoroughly unimpressed. This court will take the matter under advisement. In the meantime, I am issuing a temporary cease and desist on all further construction until jurisdiction over the waterway can be properly established. Mr. Wainwright, your clients are to halt all work immediately. It was a small victory, but by that point, the damage was already done. The condos were built. Stopping further work did not undo what was already sitting on my lake. As we left the courthouse, Harold put a hand on my shoulder. The spring thaw is going to be very interesting. That is one word for it. March crawled by. The temperatures started rising, slowly at first, then more rapidly as we moved into late March and early April. I watched the ice every day, looking for signs of weakness. The construction crew was gone, obeying the judge's order, but Veronica drove out several times to check on her investment. On one of these visits, I walked down to meet her at the lake's edge. "Still think this was a good idea?" I asked, gesturing at the condos sitting on ice that was definitely thinner than it had been a month ago. "The ice is going to melt, Mr. Strickland," she said condescendingly. "We planned for that. Those condos are designed for it. In a few weeks, you are going to see exactly how innovative our design is, and you are going to regret not partnering with us. We will see." The real thaw began on April 7th. The temperature hit 65 degrees, and I could hear the ice groaning and cracking from inside my cabin. I spent most of that day on my porch, watching and waiting. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The snow on top of the ice melted, creating puddles of standing water. The ice itself began to look gray and rotten. I could see water pooling around the base of the foundation pillars where the ice was melting faster due to the heat conducted through the concrete. Veronica showed up around noon with a small entourage, including a photographer and a man with a video camera. She was clearly planning to document the successful transition of her condos from ice to water. "The big moment," she announced to her crew, loud enough for me to hear from my porch. "In a few hours, Pine Valley Heights luxury lakeside condos will officially be waterborne. Start getting footage of everything." I just sat in my rocking chair and watched. By mid-afternoon, the ice was visibly deteriorating. Large cracks appeared, running in zigzag patterns across the surface. Water was seeping up through the cracks, further weakening the overall structure. The condos began to shift slightly, no longer sitting level as the ice beneath them became uneven. Veronica noticed this, and her confident smile started to falter. "That is just part of the process," she said to her photographer, though she sounded less certain. Then, around 4 in the afternoon, physics came to collect its due. The first condo to go was number 23, one of the units in the middle of the development. The ice beneath it gave way with a sharp crack that echoed across the lake like a gunshot. The entire structure lurched downward, still attached to its foundation pillar, but no longer supported by solid ice. The wooden frame screamed in protest as the steel brackets tried to hold the weight of the building. They could not. The brackets sheared off with a series of metallic pops, and the condo dropped straight down into the frigid water. It hit with a massive splash, sending waves radiating outward across the patches of open water and causing more ice to crack under the pressure. Veronica screamed. The cameraman kept filming. That first collapse triggered a chain reaction. The shifting weight and the waves destabilized the ice around the other condos. Within minutes, a second unit went down, then a third. They fell like dominoes, each collapse making the next one more inevitable. "No, no, no!" Veronica was running back and forth along the shore, her expensive heels sinking into the mud. "The brackets were rated for that weight. The engineer said they would hold." "Your engineer apparently did not account for the dynamic load of a building suddenly dropping when the ice disappeared," I called from my porch. "Static weight and dynamic weight are very different things." She spun toward me, her face contorted with rage. "You did this. You sabotaged the construction somehow. I did not touch anything. I just waited for spring." By sunset, 31 of the 47 condos had collapsed into the water. The remaining 16 were listing badly, tilted at dangerous angles as the ice beneath them continued to melt unevenly. A few were still partially supported by intact sections of ice, but it was only a matter of time. Veronica was on her phone, screaming at someone. I caught fragments of the conversation. I do not care what time it is, we need the emergency crew out here now. We have to save the remaining units. But there was nothing to save. By the time any emergency crew could arrive, the ice would be too weak to support workers and equipment. Any attempt to access the condos would just accelerate the collapse. I went inside and made myself dinner, occasionally glancing out the window to watch the progress. Every hour or so, another condo would give up and slip beneath the surface. The sounds of destruction cracking wood, groaning metal, splashing water became the soundtrack of my evening. By midnight, only 7 condos remained partially above water, and by dawn the next morning, all 47 were gone. My lake looked like a disaster movie set. Wooden debris floated everywhere. The foundation pillars stood like headstones, marking the graves of Veronica's ambition. Chunks of ice still drifted among the wreckage, melting steadily under the April sun. I took hundreds of photos and videos, documenting everything. Veronica returned at 8 in the morning with her husband, the county commissioner, Richard Ashford. He was a beefy man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that looked ridiculous, given he was standing in the mud next to a lake full of destroyed buildings. "Mr. Strickland," he called out in a booming voice clearly meant to intimidate, "we need to discuss compensation." I walked down from the cabin. Compensation for what? For the destruction of 47 residential units. The property damage is in excess of $3 million. I laughed. It just came out. I could not help it. "You want me to compensate you for destroying buildings that you built illegally on my property?" "The permits were legal," Richard insisted. "The construction was approved. You had a responsibility to notify us if you believed there was any risk to the structures. I told your wife repeatedly that the ice was going to melt. I told your construction foreman. I filed a legal injunction, which you delayed until it was too late. This is entirely on you." Richard's face turned red. "You are going to pay for this one way or another. If not voluntarily, then through the courts. We have 32 families who purchased these condos in good faith. They are going to sue you for every penny you have." "Let them sue. I am sure a judge will be very interested to hear how the president of an HOA and a county commissioner conspired to build on private property using fraudulent permits." "Those permits were not fraudulent," Veronica shrieked. Her composure from yesterday was completely gone. Her hair was a mess, her makeup smudged. She looked like she had not slept. "We followed the process." "A process you created specifically to steal my land," I said. "Harold has already filed complaints with the state attorney general's office. We have documentation of everything: the backdated permits, the fake public notices, the rushed construction timeline. You were hoping to present the court with a fait accompli, something so established it would be easier to let stand than to tear down. But nature tore it down for us." Richard stepped forward, trying to loom over me. "You are making powerful enemies, Strickland." "You built 47 buildings on my lake," I said calmly. "You made an enemy first." They left, but I knew it was not over, not by a long shot. Over the next week, the real scope of the disaster became clear. The 32 families who had purchased condos in presale were indeed threatening legal action, though their lawyers were now scrambling to figure out who to actually sue. Veronica's HOA had collected down payments totaling over $800,000. Those families wanted their money back, plus damages. The problem was that Veronica had already spent most of that money on the construction itself. The HOA's bank accounts were nearly empty. The construction company was demanding payment for their work. The engineer who designed the floating system was being sued for malpractice. Everyone was pointing fingers at everyone else. And then the environmental reports started coming in. Turns out that dumping 47 buildings worth of construction materials into a pristine spring-fed lake is an ecological disaster. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources sent inspectors who took one look at the debris field and immediately issued citations. The wooden structures had been treated with chemical preservatives. The buildings contained insulation, drywall, electrical wiring, plumbing with copper pipes, and various other materials that were now leaching into the water. The DNR handed Veronica and the Pine Valley Heights HOA a cleanup order with an estimated cost of $600,000. They had 90 days to remove all debris from the lake and restore it to its natural state, or face daily fines of $10,000. Veronica called me, begging. "Please, Mr. Strickland, we made a mistake. I admit that. But these fines are going to bankrupt the HOA. Families are going to lose their homes. Can we work something out?" "You should have thought about that before you built on my lake." "We will pay you," she pleaded. "Whatever you want. Just help us negotiate with the DNR." "The DNR does not negotiate. You poisoned a natural lake. Clean it up." She hung up on me. The cleanup took most of the summer. The HOA had to hire a specialized marine salvage company to dredge the lake for debris. They brought in cranes and barges, working methodically through June and July to pull up twisted metal, soggy wood, and all the remnants of their failed development. Each day, trucks hauled away tons of waterlogged garbage. I watched them work from my porch, occasionally bringing Herald updates. The legal situation was becoming increasingly complicated and increasingly favorable for me. The state attorney general's office had launched a formal investigation into Richard Ashford's role in the fraudulent permit process. Emails had surfaced showing that he had backdated the waterway designation and deliberately excluded me from notification. More importantly, it turned out that Richard had a financial stake in the development through a shell company. He was not just helping his wife. He stood to profit directly from condos built on land he helped designate as public waterway. That was corruption. Actual, prosecutable corruption. In late July, Richard Ashford was arrested at his office. The charges included fraud, embezzlement of public trust, and abuse of authority. The local news covered it extensively. I gave several interviews, explaining how a county commissioner had tried to steal my property to enrich himself and his wife's HOA. Veronica was not arrested, but she was named in multiple civil suits. The families who had lost their down payments were suing her personally. The construction company was suing. The engineer was suing. Even the other members of the Pine Valley Heights HOA board were suing, claiming she had exceeded her authority and exposed them to liability. By August, the lake was finally clean. The salvage company had removed every piece of debris they could find. The DNR inspectors returned and took new water samples. The chemical levels were elevated but declining naturally. They estimated the lake ecosystem would fully recover within 2 years. The foundation pillars were still there, standing in the water like a modern Stonehenge. The DNR said they could stay as long as they were not leaching anything harmful. I actually did not mind them. They served as a reminder, visible every day from my porch, of what happened when people got too greedy. In September, I settled all the claims against me. Harold negotiated a deal where I paid nothing, but in exchange, I agreed not to pursue additional damages against Veronica or the HOA for the environmental damage to my property. Given that the HOA was bankrupt and Veronica was facing personal bankruptcy, there was not much to collect anyway. It was easier to just end it. Richard Ashford went to trial in October. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and 2 counts of abuse of authority. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $350,000 in restitution, though everyone knew he would never be able to pay that much. His assets had been seized, and his career was obviously over. Veronica lost everything. Her house went into foreclosure. She resigned from the HOA in disgrace. The Pine Valley Heights community voted to dissolve the HOA entirely and reform as a simple neighborhood association with no enforcement authority. Nobody wanted anything to do with the organization that had caused such catastrophic failure. The families who lost their down payments eventually recovered most of their money through insurance claims in the bankruptcy proceedings, though it took nearly a year. They were angry, but most of them directed that anger at Veronica and Richard rather than at me. A few tried to argue I should have done more to stop the construction, but those claims went nowhere legally. By the following spring, exactly 1 year after the Great Thaw, life had returned to normal. My lake was peaceful again. The water was clear. Fish were jumping. Eagles nested in the tall pines along the shore. The foundation pillars had become roosting spots for cormorants and gulls, which I found oddly appropriate. I was sitting on my porch one warm April morning, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise, when a car pulled up. I tensed, wondering if this was going to be another legal complication, but the woman who got out was not anyone I recognized. She was in her 30s, dressed casually in jeans and a flannel shirt. She waved as she approached the porch. "Mr. Strickland, my name is Jennifer Morrison. I am a reporter with Minnesota Environmental Magazine. I was hoping I could interview you about what happened here." I considered sending her away, but then figured the story should be told properly by someone who would get the details right. "Sure. Want some coffee?" We spent 2 hours talking. I showed her all the photos and videos I had taken. I explained the whole timeline, from discovering the construction to watching it all sink into the lake. She took careful notes and asked smart questions. "What do you think was the biggest mistake they made?" she asked near the end of the interview. I thought about that. Arrogance. Veronica was so convinced that she could force her vision onto my property that she never stopped to consider whether she should. She assumed that having permits, even fraudulent ones, meant she was right. She never once thought about the lake as an actual ecosystem or me as an actual person with legitimate property rights. To her, I was just an obstacle to remove. Jennifer nodded. And the fact that her husband was a county commissioner let her think she could get away with it. Exactly. Power corrupts. They genuinely believed they were above the rules. The article came out in June. It was a long, detailed piece that became surprisingly popular. It got shared widely on social media, and suddenly I was getting messages from people all over the country who had their own HOA horror stories. The difference was that most of them did not have lakes they could use for poetic justice. A few people suggested I should write a book about the experience. I considered it, but ultimately decided against it. I'd spent 18 months dealing with Veronica's nightmare. I was ready to move on. The legal settlements had actually left me in better shape financially than before. The DNR had required an environmental survey of my entire property as part of the cleanup, and that survey had been paid for by the HOA's insurance. I now had detailed documentation of every aspect of my land, which would make it much harder for anyone to try something like this again. More importantly, the case had created legal precedent. Harold told me that lawyers across Minnesota were citing Strickland versus Pine Valley Heights, HOA, in property rights cases. The ruling had made it much harder for local governments to designate private waterways without clear justification and proper notification. Richard Ashford's conviction had sent a message to other officials about the consequences of corruption. I never heard from Veronica again. I looked her up once out of curiosity and found that she had moved to Arizona, presumably to start over somewhere her name was not synonymous with catastrophic failure. Richard was still in prison with a release date scheduled for 4 years in the future. The Pine Valley Heights neighborhood slowly recovered. Property values had dropped significantly during the scandal, but they gradually climbed back up. The neighborhood association that replaced the HOA was apparently run very conservatively, with minimal rules and no enforcement beyond basic property maintenance. The residents had learned their lesson about giving too much power to busybodies like Veronica. As for me, I was exactly where I wanted to be, sitting on my porch, looking at my lake, surrounded by wilderness and solitude. The foundation pillars were still there, slowly being colonized by aquatic plants and providing habitat for small fish. In a weird way, they had become part of the lake's ecosystem. On quiet mornings, I would sometimes imagine what Veronica had been thinking as she watched her condos sink one by one. Had she felt remorse, anger, panic? Probably all three. But mostly, I imagined, she felt shock. Shock that someone had stood up to her. Shock that her carefully laid plans had failed so spectacularly. Shock that nature did not care about her permits or her husband's authority. You cannot build on a frozen lake and expect it to stay frozen forever. That was the lesson. Spring always comes. The ice always melts. And when you have built your schemes on a foundation that was never solid to begin with, everything comes crashing down. I had not wanted to be vindictive. I had just wanted to protect what was mine. But watching those condos sink had been satisfying in a way I could not quite articulate. It was not about revenge. It was about justice. Natural, inevitable, undeniable justice. The lake had defended itself. I just waited for it to happen. 2 years after the initial discovery of construction equipment on my ice, I finally felt like the chapter was completely closed. I had dated a woman from Duluth for a few months, though it did not work out. I had taken up kayaking, enjoying the freedom of gliding across my lake without worrying about who might be watching. I had even started writing software for environmental monitoring systems, putting my engineering skills to use in a way that felt meaningful. Life was good. The nightmare was over. And then one afternoon in late summer, I saw a car coming down my access road. It was a sheriff's vehicle, and my heart sank. What now? Sheriff Morrison himself got out. He was an older man, close to retirement, and he had always been professional during the investigation. He walked up to my porch with an envelope in his hand. "Mr. Strickland," he said, tipping his hat, "got something for you." I took the envelope. Inside was a check for $63,000. What is this? Restitution, Sheriff Morrison explained. Part of Richard Ashford's asset seizure was liquidated. The court determined that you were owed compensation for the use of your property, the environmental damage, and your legal fees. This is your share. I stared at the check. I had not expected this. The settlement had specifically waived additional damages. The criminal case had separate provisions, the sheriff continued, reading my confusion. This is not part of the civil settlements. This is the court saying that a crime was committed against you and you deserve compensation from the criminal's assets. I said, still processing. Thank you. You earned it. What Ashford did was unconscionable. A lot of people in the county were embarrassed by the whole thing. He made us all look bad. Sheriff Morrison paused, then added, "For what it is worth, I am glad you fought them. People like Veronica need to learn they cannot just steamroll over everyone." After he left, I sat on the porch holding the check. $63,000. It was not a fortune, but it was substantial. I could use it to make improvements to the cabin, or invest it, or take a long vacation. Or I could use it to make absolutely sure nothing like this ever happened again. I called Harold. I want to create a legal trust for the property, something that would survive me and protect this land in perpetuity. Can we do that? Absolutely. It is called a conservation easement. You basically deed the development rights to a land trust. The property can be inherited or sold, but it can never be commercially developed. The wilderness stays wild. Let's do it. We spent the next several months working out the details. The land trust was established with the restitution money as its initial funding. The easement was filed with the county, ironically requiring approval from the same commission that Richard Ashford had once sat on. His replacement, a woman named Patricia Torres, personally called me to express her support. "The county is grateful for what you are doing," she said. "Preserving wild spaces benefits everyone. And honestly, after the Ashford scandal, we are being very careful about property rights. Your easement application is the easiest one I have seen." The easement was approved unanimously. My 200 acres, including the 15-acre lake, were now permanently protected from development. No HOA, no county commissioner, no future owner could ever build anything beyond the existing cabin and a few small outbuildings. The land would remain wild. I felt something release in my chest when I signed the final papers. It was done. Truly, completely done. That winter was the most peaceful I had experienced since inheriting the property. The lake froze solid again, but this time there were no construction crews, no drilling equipment, no ambitious HOAs with big plans. Just clean white ice, snow-covered pines, and the occasional deer wandering past my window. I started keeping a journal, documenting the wildlife I saw, the weather patterns, the subtle changes in the forest through the seasons. It was therapeutic, giving me something to focus on besides the craziness of the previous 2 years. In February, I got an unexpected letter. It was from one of the families that had lost money in the condo presale, a couple named David and Sandra Chen. They wrote to apologize. "We were among the people who initially blamed you for not stopping the construction more aggressively," the letter read. "We were wrong. We have since learned the full extent of what the Ashfords did, and we realize you were a victim just like us. We are sorry for any hostile messages or thoughts we directed your way. Thank you for standing up to corruption. We hope you can enjoy your beautiful property in peace." I was surprised by how much that letter affected me. I had grown a thick skin during the legal battles, learning to ignore the accusations and blame, but having someone acknowledge that I had been right, that I had been the victim, that I had acted properly, it meant more than I expected. I wrote back, thanking them for the letter and wishing them well. I included a photo of the lake in winter, pristine and beautiful, and wrote, "This is what we were fighting for. I hope you can visit someday and see it in person." They did visit that following summer. The Chens drove up from Minneapolis with their 2 kids, and I gave them a tour of the property. The kids loved spotting the foundation pillars and hearing the story of how the condos had sunk. David shook my head firmly as they left. "You did good," he said simply. "The world needs more people willing to stand up to bullies." By the 3rd anniversary of the initial construction, the story had faded from public attention. Occasionally, someone would recognize my name and ask if I was that guy with the lake, but mostly, life returned to a comfortable anonymity. The environmental magazine article remained popular online, and I would sometimes get emails from people asking for advice on fighting their own HOAs. But otherwise, I was just a guy living in the woods. Richard Ashford was released early for good behavior after serving 4 years. I heard through the grapevine that he moved to Wisconsin and took a job as an insurance adjuster. His law license had been revoked, his political career was dead, and his marriage to Veronica had ended in divorce. He had paid a heavy price for his corruption. Veronica, as far as I knew, was still in Arizona. Someone told me she was working as a real estate agent, which seemed ironic given how spectacularly her development project had failed. But people have to make a living, and I held no particular animosity toward her anymore. She had been arrogant and foolish, and she had paid the price. That was enough. The lake fully recovered, just as the DNR had predicted. The water quality tests came back perfect. The fish population was healthy. Beavers built a dam on the north inlet, creating a small marsh that attracted even more wildlife. The ecosystem had proven resilient, able to absorb the damage and heal itself given time. I like to think the lake was always going to win. Veronica's condos were temporary, artificial, imposed on a natural system that operated by its own rules. The spring thaw was inevitable. The collapse was inevitable. All I did was wait for nature to take its course. That is the thing about living in harmony with the land versus trying to dominate it. The land is patient. The land is powerful. And the land always eventually wins. Now, sitting on my porch on this warm May afternoon, watching dragonflies skim across the surface of my lake, I feel a deep sense of contentment. The foundation pillars are covered in moss and bird droppings, slowly weathering into something that looks almost natural. In another decade or 2, they might be indistinguishable from the dead trees that occasionally stand in the shallows. I built nothing, and I won everything. I protected what mattered. I waited for spring. And when the ice melted, justice came with the thaw. The lake is still mine. The wilderness is still wild. And Veronica's 47 luxury condos are somewhere at the bottom, slowly being reclaimed by sediment and time, a monument to hubris that nobody will ever see. I raise my coffee mug toward the water in a silent toast, to patience, to persistence, to standing up for what is right even when everyone tells you to give up, and most of all, to letting nature be your ally when the law fails you. The lake sparkles in the afternoon sun, peaceful and perfect, exactly as it should be, exactly as it will remain, protected now by legal easement and by the memory of what happened to those who tried to exploit it. I smile and take another sip of coffee. Spring came. Nature collected rent. And I am still here, exactly where I belong, watching over the land my grandfather loved and trusted me to protect. Some battles are won with lawyers and judges. Some are won by simply waiting for the ice to melt. I did both, and in the end, the lake itself delivered the most satisfying victory of all. Watching those condos sink one by one, understanding that physics and nature were more powerful than any corrupt commissioner or ambitious HOA president, gave me a faith in the world that no legal ruling could match. The sun dips lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. A loon calls from across the lake, its haunting cry echoing off the water. I lean back in my rocking chair and close my eyes, listening to the sounds of the wilderness that almost was not, but is, and always will be.